Thank you for joining us for the beta session available of the second lot. And I'm sure it's fine what they're saying upstairs, but it'll be far more interesting here. I do apologise. A number of you have commented that this room is a little bit chilly. We have asked them to up the temperature. I'm not sure if that has gone through or not, but I'm sure we'll have a very lively and heated conversation nonetheless. Now, a number of people commented as we were heading into this event that there were quite a few people from the right sitting on these panels. And I wanted to just take the opportunity to assure you that was not by our design at all. I'm not sure exactly what there is left for us to do, though, when we time and time again reach out to participants and actors and commentators from across the political spectrum, and only one side respond to it. And even those that would like to participate in conversations, people like Heather Duplessis-Allen, who was very keen actually to come and join us here today and participate in this conversation. She said, yes, of course, let me just put it past my management, who then said, no, actually, I don't think speaking at the Free Speech Conference would be acceptable. So I'm not sure exactly what it is about our positions that are so unacceptable to them. Of course, if there were a counter to the Free Speech Union in New Zealand, the anti-Free Speech Union, I think they were called the Disinformation Project or something like that, of course, or the Centre to Counter Violent Extremism, they do go and participate in those conversations. Simply a note to say I'm not sure what there is left to do. But nonetheless, we have fantastic participants as it is. Senior ministers and a former senior minister and Auckland City Councillor. Though it's often interesting because the current sitting politicians often have such kind of weaselly answers in terms of not being able to commit to specific things, and you kind of just let loose still. No, so of course, David Seymour, leader of the ACT Party, Minister for Regulation, Paul Goldsmith, Minister for Justice and Minister for Media, and Maurice Williamson. Can I ask you guys maybe to come in at a 30,000-foot level, and then before long we'll end up with questions from the audience as well, and just say the Free Speech Union goes out and attempts to make the case to our 100,000 person base and Kiwis across the country that there is a cultural value worth fighting for in free speech, that free speech and democracy are not the same thing, but without free speech, democracy is impossible, and that we are facing really serious crises when it comes to the basic rights to think freely and speak freely. Can I sound you guys out on what your impression is of the issue as it stands and steps that are afoot to address it? David, can we start with you?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. It's great to see a group of people who are prepared to give up their afternoon to actually celebrate an important value, especially one that's intangible. Often hard to get people to give up real time and real tangible stuff for something that is just an idea, but an idea that's critical to everything else, including, in this particular question, democracy. I think I'd break it down into two sides. One is, what's the legal environment? There's some parts of the Human Rights Act that I'd rather not have, but the case law around that is not too bad. For the most part, I think we have a very good legal environment. We don't have hate speech laws. I think a lot of people in this room would like to take credit for defeating the previous government's sort of lingering proposition that never quite was, and that's a very positive thing. So there's not a huge amount that can be done, I don't think, to improve the legal environment. However, the cultural environment towards speech is about as bad as it could ever be. Now, I say this as someone who was only born in the 80s. I sense that there probably were times earlier in our history that were actually a lot more censorious. However, when it comes to just the basic cultural acceptance that people should be able to think their thoughts, feel their feelings and express them without prejudice, without anger at the mere fact that they're doing that, we seem to be in an intolerant time. In fact, I spoke to someone a few years ago who'd recently returned to New Zealand, and she put it about as well as I've ever heard it. And she said, this is supposed to be an age of enlightenment, and yet you have to walk on eggshells with everything that you say. Now, I think a whole lot of people will be trying to make sense of the American election result, and people will be lining up with their prior assumptions and working out how they can fit them to the data. And I'm no exception, so here's mine. A whole lot of people out there decided that actually they didn't want the identity that they were presumed to have. They decided that they were, as Hayek would say, thinking and valuing beings, able and entitled to pursue their own goals, which might be terribly inconvenient to a lot of the people in the press and certainly the Democratic Party, but nonetheless they stood up to be counted on their terms. And perhaps this vast, multi-billion-dollar marketing and democratic enterprise that they do every 4 years has produced some new data, and that data might actually force a few people to reconsider their positions, and they call it Trump 2.0. This is New Zealand, so I'm going to call it kindness 2.0. And this means real kindness. It actually means being respectful to people, just the basic dignity of being human. And I found this in the last few years, when it takes an urban liberal from the seat of Epsom to actually show some real kindness to, evil licensed firearm owners and evil farmers who, you guys are from the city, you may not know, they actually get the cows to just back up and shit straight into the rivers. That's how it works. It must be, because farmers are actually out there trying to destroy their own livelihoods and property. That's how stupid they are, if only we made more rules for them. But what I found was that, I actually spent the last few years trying to be kind to a bunch of people that the government of kindness and inclusion wasn't. And I think kindness 2.0 could be a really useful concept for a lot of us. So I've rabbited on far more than supposed to, but it is a free speech event. So there's some to start.
Paul, Nigel Bigot has been on tour with us this week. We've had him at about 35 events over 5 days. We run them hard. And he was talking with Leighton Smith on News Talk ZB. And Leighton opened his podcast by saying, I thought the Free Speech Union was out there making a mountain out of a molehill. I really thought they were overstating the case. And yet I've become convinced that this is an existential moment. Do you agree that we could say free speech is at a point of crisis, culturally, if not legally, in our country?
I wouldn't say an existential threat. What I would say is it's a core universal human right that we take for granted at our peril. And the first point I'd say is that the Free Speech Union has been a fantastic thing for this country over the past few years, and I commend you for the work you've done and the organisation that you've built and the voice that you have had. You grow up in a country that has benefited from these norms that have been developed over the last couple of centuries. One person, one vote, free speech, the rule of law, limited liability companies, a whole sort of suite of things that have been fundamental to our success as a community. And but they're not necessarily obvious, and they need to. The case for them needs to be continually remade. And of course, you have many people who think the obvious, and I think it's actually a more natural human inclination to stop people talking about things that you don't want to hear. The natural human inclination is to be part of your core of thinking, and only sort of to see other people with different views to be a threat and hostile. So it's not a natural thing, and so it needs to be, the case needs to be built. I think that the mood sort of swings. I think 2 or 3 years ago was I think peak hostility to that, particularly overseas and around the world, and I think you're seeing a rebalancing starting and underway, and I think it's the job of you and the government's very much of the view that we need to reassert, defend, and stand strongly on the side of people being able to express their views, have an open, honest debate about issues, and not be shut down, and to have the uncomfortable conversations that we need to have. So existential threat, I think that might be a slightly overblown given all the positions that we have, but needs to be maintained, absolutely.
I think that's a very important point, that censorship is a very human impulse.
Yep.
And certainly for those with our base, we try and affirm the fact that it is natural when you hear something insulting or offensive or blasphemous, or however we want to construe that, to feel like shutting that down is appropriate. And yet we are better off, in reality, how historically have we responded to difference, for the most part, a difference of religion, difference of race, difference of political opinion. Largely across human history, the way we've responded to it is by trying to knock the other side on the head. And I do think, actually, I would rather live in a country like this. One of the comments that we often hear is, we didn't know we needed to defend it. I hear this quite often, and I made this comment earlier in the week. We get contacted quite often by superannuitants who ask us, do you have a superannuitants rate? And I say, yes, you'll be very pleased to know some of you here will benefit from this. Well, some of you will, it will apply to you at least. We have a superannuitants rate. We ask you to pay more because it's your fault that we're here. And my generation takes a bit of flack for where we are, and I think a lot of the blame we're happy to bear. That being said, we're a staff of almost 10, and almost all of us are in our 20s. So there's a young portion that are committed to these virtues as well. However, I do think that, over the past 60 years, or 60 years ago, there was an assumption that free speech didn't need to be defended. It was a given. It was a cultural reality that was simply accepted. And over time, perhaps that neglect has led to an erosion. What are your comments on that, Maurice?
Well, it's a bit difficult for me to speak because I think David said pretty much what I believe. But because I'm a mathematician and no, I disagreed with a bit of yours. Because I'm a mathematician, I'm a really big fan of using data and graphs. And I want you to think of a graph of the correlation between those countries that have been incredibly successful, have delivered fantastic standards of living, have had their people going on to standards of education and their ability to live and love and everything else, compared to those where they are just sitting in absolute barren nothingness with nothing to produce. And the correlation between that graph and where freedom of speech sits in those countries is stark, absolutely stark. You cannot name me, other than possibly Singapore, and that's a bit of an outlier because of its command economy type thing. You cannot name me a successful country that has clamped down on free speech, that has stopped people having their views expressed publicly and so on, that has been a success. And you cannot name me one that has been a phenomenal, successful nation that hasn't had that ability to express their views at the ballot box. And having been a consul general in the States for quite a few years and just back from there, I can tell you one thing. The Democrats are bloody lucky Donald Trump's got his foibles and his girlfriends and his court case, because if it hadn't been for that, he would have taken every state. He is so popular with his policies and what he's trying to do with the country, and the only downside the others could say is, oh, well, he's got a porn star in his locker or something. And frankly, that's just, they've risen above it. The people have had a guts full of that. And the guy, because of the opening the economies, trying to make things function, the people listen to that. And your ordinary person out in television land felt like they'd finally had a voice rather than the elitist sitting in Washington deciding on their behalf. We'll decide on your behalf. So the limit of free speech only ends when you get into defamation, and as far as I'm concerned, if there's good defamation laws, you can actually use those. I was defamed.
And incitement to violence.
Well, incitement to violence, yeah, well, okay, that's a defamation in a way. But, okay, let me just tell you, I had a newspaper come out once when I was Minister of Communications saying, loose lips sink ships. Minister Williamson this week disclosed all of Clear Communications' confidential financial information to Roderick Dean at Telecom. And it just was not even close to true because I didn't even have access to their financial data, let alone having met with Roderick Dean. So I took the buggers to court. And we ended up with a really good settlement and a huge chunk of money. The only problem is it cost the taxpayer a huge amount of money for the lawyers to go through the process, and we won. And the settlement was that full legal costs eventually came back, and we covered it, so it was a zero-sum game. If I'd been an ordinary person in society, I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have even started to do that. I had the taxpayer behind me with QCs in those days, not KCs, against a newspaper that had decided to just tell bullshit and wouldn't step down until they realised they were in the gun for it. So defamation laws are good, but how you enforce them without having a bloody big bank account behind you is one thing that I think's worrying.
This is a panel on politics and free speech, but there's quite a big gulf between government and politics and the experience of everyday individuals and the wider culture that defines our society, and often that is mediated through our institutions. And Paul, you referenced the fact that over the past 3 years, and to the credit, while far from perfect, the new government has pivoted away from many of the considerable mistakes that were being made.
You're very gracious.
We need to talk about so much more than the symptoms that are bubbling up through governments that are really the expression of a popular vote. One of the reasons that the Labour government were pursuing hate speech laws is that unfortunately many people in New Zealand and most institutions think that people do need to be protected from harmful opinions. And I think institutional capture is far more the cause of the demise that we're facing. And so, Janet, I hope you don't mind me pointing you out, but we have Janet Dixon here, a real estate agent who has effectively been told she needs to sign or pass a religious test in order to remain a real estate agent. We have Thomas Newman, who has been helping lead the work alongside others, pushing against what he believes is ideological capture with respect to tikanga mandated education. These institutions seem to be losing faith, our people seem to be losing faith in these institutions because they've lost their credibility and legitimacy. How do we go about making sure that these institutions promulgate free speech? Do they do that better in the US, Maurice?
Yeah, I think because the US has at least a whole range of different media outlets, and you can get from one of them the one that the other won't let you, and so on. If you watch bloody television in New Zealand, you're just looking at nothing but shit. And
if I can correct you...
And I'm sorry, that's on a good day.
There was a moment yesterday on TV, on breakfast TV, that I thought was less than shit, but they are relatively rare.
I've already congratulated David. I don't know how you stay so bloody calm, because it was just appalling, and this is very divisive. I'd like you to name one bill, certainly none of the ones I put through Parliament, like deregulating coastal shipping and bringing in the photo driver's licence. Name one bill that doesn't have views from the other side that disagree with you. But that's divisive. That means you wouldn't pass any legislation in the entire country, because there's always people with a different view to yours. You've got to put yours up, debate it, and see if you can win the popular support for it. So, but in the US, what was really good, there were a number of radio shows, a number of television channels and so on, and of course social media, which has changed everything. So you no longer just get the state is telling you this. I'll stop very quickly, but one thing. When I became Minister of Broadcasting in 1990, the TV3 owners came to see me the first week, said we're in deep stook. We're in financial difficulty, we've got the receivers called in, and we need some legislative change. I said, if you're looking for money from the government, you're dreaming. Ruth Richardson won't give me $1. And they said, no, we don't need any money, we just need to allow foreign ownership of the media. And I said, but we do, because foreign Murdoch-owned newspapers, not the electronic media. Up until 1990, foreigners could not own the electronic media, so we had to change that. The more we can get you exposed to a whole lot of different media and not just one state-owned channel, the better off we'll be.
What does diversity in institutions look like?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the United States, we do sort of pick up a lot of the trends, obviously, that start there, and the universities obviously have an enormous amount of responsibility for where a lot of these sort of ideas start from, particularly in the US. They come through to New Zealand. I mean, it's nothing new. I did a MA in history, which I very much enjoyed at university 30 years ago, but it was the time in my life when I felt least able to express my views freely. And that was 30 years ago at university, so nothing new about it. There was, this is the way, this is the truth, you've got to agree with this, otherwise you're a heretic. We're very, very open discussions there on a regular basis. So, look...
As you can see, this was just a setup for Paul.
Yeah. Well, am I supposed to be the left winger on this panel or something? What is this?
You are.
I'd just like to say I feel uncomfortable. Look, but it comes back to the point I make. The thing that has changed dramatically over the last few years is, as Maurice says, there is now no way that anybody can monopolise views and communication. So it doesn't matter how bad you might, if you're not meeting the market, or if you're being completely unreasonable in your views, people just go somewhere else, and there's so many other places to go. So that's the countervailing force, which is great, and so obviously governments, don't want to be in the business of propping up institutions that are heading in the wrong direction. Now, of course, how you handle all that and how you do that in terms of maintaining independence in the university sector, for example, is not straightforward. But these are the conversations that we've got to have. But it starts there, I think, and then it flows its way through the compulsory sector of the education system, and from there it flows its way into the public service. And I think that's one of the realities that we face as a country. And I was interested in watching the US elections. I think I saw the Washington, D.C. result was 95% Democrat and 5% Republican. It's not quite that extreme in Wellington, but it's not far off. So getting a diversity of thought within the public sector is important as well. So all those institutions, we've got a battle on our hands. But the battle is to come up with ideas and express them strongly and stand up for these basic principles.
So how would your government respond to steps, for example, of drawing in a line the real estate authority and other institutions like that, and saying, requiring professionals to pass religious tests and make commitments to ideologies that have nothing to do with conveying real estate, that actually the government has a role in inserting itself to protect effectively a form of secularism in our society?
Well, I mean, each individual case needs to be dealt with by, I don't want to be sort of taking over another responsible minister's sort of policies on these things. Yes, the responsible minister in that space has to ask, what legislatively can change or does need to change, or whether it's a matter of a board that has made a decision and the board needs to be replaced. All those things that you've got to work through in an individual case. But yes, the basic principle that people shouldn't be forced to believe something that they don't believe, and that's a pretty basic sort of freedom that I'd be standing up for.
The FSU has had the opportunity to work alongside your team, David, a little bit in terms of legislation that is coming forward to address issues with respect to academic freedom. Nigel Bigger, who was obviously speaking a bit earlier, and I got to meet with the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Auckland University, and we have relatively open and frequent conversations with Vice-Chancellors, and their consistent drum to bang at the moment is that actually the government requiring them to defend free speech is invading an institutional autonomy. Why is that not correct?
They don't seem to mind when we invade their institutional autonomy with $3 billion of taxpayer funding each year. I mean, that's, that invasion's fine. And so, that's why I'm proud to say that as an ACT thing and as a government thing, we are going to legislate that if you want the money, you've got to have a free speech policy, similar to what they have at Otago. And I have to say the FSU's been quite helpful because I'm pretty busy, so I've just had advice from the FSU and advice from the Ministry of Education. That was quite different. Then I got them to talk to each other, and we seem to be getting to the right place. So thanks for your help with that. I think we're going to end up with a good law that will actually say, look, sorry, you want the cash, you got to do it. I think more generally on the institutions, I mean, there's a lot of frustration because they'll see this institution or that as, still you've been in government for a year and they're still the same doing crazy stuff. And that's true in a lot of cases. But also just make the point that at the end of the day, we still want a society with separation of power, with autonomous institutions that have roles and responsibilities. So, there's not Pyongyang. We can't just wipe the table all in one go. But there's a few things you can do. One is we control appointments. So, Stephen Rainbow is going to be a fantastic Human Rights Commissioner. I mean, that guy, he's going to be... and so will... And Melissa Darby is a Race Relations Commissioner. That's fantastic. Did you just put Philip Crump on the Broadcasting Authority?
Did.
Yeah. That was some of your best work. I love that. Richard Prebble is by far the best qualified Waitangi Tribunal. I mean, it's a shame. If he'd been elected about 3 months earlier, he would have actually been there to vote for the Treaty of Waitangi Act. These appointments really matter. And then there's what you fund. So in a way, the quid pro quo for the universities is an example of that. And then ultimately, there's the laws you make. So, if it was up to me, if it really was Pyongyang and I was Kim Jong-un, we'd just get rid of the Human Rights Commission, humanely. But to some extent, you can also change your policy. So appointments, funding, law, we are rolling the change through these institutions as we go.
Paul, if we are going to have a Human Rights Commission, how about one that doesn't actively take Court of Appeal cases in favour of hate speech laws? What would it look like to have a free speech commission like the Australians have?
Well, it's not a silly idea. It's a good, I think, a good campaign thing for the union to go for. I mean, there's a broad discussion to be had on a number of levels in terms of human rights, equally important human obligations, and I don't think we've quite got the balance right there. So that's
I'm really uncomfortable with the way that this narrative has quite consistently been rolled out over the past year of this human rights, human responsibilities type thing. Now, I expect that responsible citizens have duties in this society, but if they don't meet those duties, we don't say, well, you actually don't have the right to life anymore. You don't have the right to.
Of course not.
No, and so what? Picking
Well,
and
I mean,
choosing human rights.
a basic obligation is to obey laws in terms of
But they don't lose their basic human rights.
No, of course not. But there are consequences for it. I mean, the only point I'm making is yes, it's fundamentally important to have a human rights organisation that is standing up for human rights and defending them, and universal human rights. And as David says, he'd prefer to get rid of it. Our view is to ensure that it's focused on its core objective, which is defending and advancing human rights and universal human rights in the broad sense, such as free speech. Such as free expression, such as freedom from discrimination. So all these things are part and parcel of that. A separate issue, I suppose, is if you solely have a focus on the rights that everybody has and never talk about the expectations and responsibilities and obligations of being part of a broad society, then I think you can get things out of balance. But all of these things are the sorts of things that we should be talking about and advocating for. So yeah, that's where
the proliferation of.
I'm acutely aware that I just feel like you talked about weasel words at the front, and I figure, am I being a weasel at this point or not? I don't.
The proliferation of rights and the ever-growing list of things that people feel like they can slam on the table and often expect the government to provide for them is part of that problem. That being said, this is obviously the conversation around negative rights and positive rights and thin rights and thick rights. Freedom of speech in any of those contexts, though, is the starting point. And we have seen this government, against the advice of the Attorney General, choose to progress through legislation that explicitly undermines those rights. Now, interrupt me at any point, gentlemen, where one of you guys actually disagrees, because my suspicion is that individually you are not great advocates of these policies. But my question is, without resorting to simplistic dismissals of, well, you purists, how do we actually seek to hold governments to principle and saying we accept the political advantages that you're acquiring through passing gang patch policies and even courting ideas around swastikas, which I find very disturbing, and actually call them to stand for to assist us in educating the public and remind Kiwis why these basic rights exist, and despite the natural impulse towards censorship, why in the long term it's a bad idea. Who wants to take that? Maurice, do you want to talk to that?
Well, I'm a real minimalist on any rules. I just think that the moment you put rules in place, there are other people just on the other side of the sand line you've drawn that, well, why not me, or why aren't I included? And so the best thing is to try and stay right out of that stuff if you can, and let the law take its place. If someone's advocating killing people, that's something that should be dealt with completely separate to your right to free speech in other areas. But I'm really concerned about balance in rights. I mean, I think I've got rights, So I go to an Auckland Transport meeting. I've just been put on the board, and the first board meeting we go to, it opens up with about a 5-minute karakia in Māori. Now, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in a God. Why am I having to sit through a 5-minute prayer in another language that I don't understand? But when I've objected to that, I'm told, no, we got a directive from Auckland Council under Phil Goff's regime, we must have the karakia before we start at each meeting. What about my rights? I should say I object to that, but then who do you count for? We've decided, and I think that's the thing that makes me more angry. We've decided on your behalf what's right for you and what's not. And I think the more that goes on, the more the public will demand the ability to, and I think Janet Dixon's an absolute stunning example, lives in my electorate, and I'm proud to have her out there, of saying no. I got caught on one just recently. Let me tell you, it's out of the courts now, so I can tell you. We all went to the appointments committee one day at council to appoint the new chair of Watercare. Huge business, one of the biggest businesses in New Zealand. Massively important to get right, because if we don't, you're stuffed for your water rates and everything. And the name that was being put up, I didn't like. I didn't think the person had enough experience in infrastructure investment, in networks and so on. But I knew one of the applications was a guy called Jeff Hunt, who'd worked for Cordia, and I'd had dealings with the guy through my time as Communications Minister. So I moved an amendment to change the name from what it was to Jeff Hunt. We put it to the vote, and it won. And Jeff Hunt got appointed. And the Independent Māori Statutory Board at Council, which is not elected, and you have no say over, took us to court. A council body took the council to court because of a decision we had taken democratically, and the judge said, you didn't take any account of whether this person had any background in tikanga Māori. Now, we ended up overturning that by going back and saying to Jeff, tell us about your experience of tikanga. And he told us a couple of things. He could say cat and dog and a few other words. And we said, right, that's met the qualification. We went back and redid the committee again, and Jeff Hunt is now the chair of Watercare. Thank God. There's something wrong with that an unelected judge who sits there forever with a tenure, who decides on our behalf, you as a democratically elected, we were all elected councillors by you, have decided on this one person, and the judge says, no, I'm throwing it out. You have a think about that.
Yeah, just in terms of your question on gang patch, Lords, it's a good example, and I make no apologies. We campaigned very hard when you went out on the doorsteps last year for the election. Number one issue, Country Mile, was cost of living. Number two, consistently, certainly in the north half of the North Island, was law and order. People concerned about public safety, concerned about fear and intimidation, all those sorts of things. So if you want to start, our goal is to reduce the number of victims of violent crime and serious offending. The gangs are way out of proportion in all of that, and so you can't get anywhere if you don't deal more effectively with gangs, and that's a matter of some pretty tough policies on that. Now, it does, of course, impinge on their freedom of expression by banning gang patches, and we're up to defend that. We say, well, yep, people have also got a right to be able to go around in their community without the level of intimidation that we've seen. But the only point I'd make from your point of view is the fact that you're out there asking that tough question and making us explain ourselves. Good thing for democracy. And if I feel uncomfortable about that and we have an internal come out, good thing.
Wonderful.
And it's nice to have a diversity of views on these matters, because for a very long time there was nobody standing up for these things, and so
And I think the Free Speech Union has been gone to great lengths to try and insist on the case that we have no interest whatsoever in defending the illegal activity of gangs. Sure. Go after them. They peddle in misery and crime, and we only hear the same expression that you do, that Kiwis are very keen on the rule of law being upheld. However, we are, and we express our members' views in this, deeply concerned that it sets a terrible precedent, that politicians far less scrupulous than you will seek to abuse that. And I think the sort of thing that we can use to undermine potential weakness is to set a cultural precedent as well. So that's why the Free Speech Union has created our own gang patch, as you can see. And I anticipate these might be quite popular. This is a gift for you, Paul. And I think a wonderful... I think a wonderful cultural precedent would be if we saw the Minister of Justice wearing this shirt in the future. It makes it far less likely that the Free Speech Union gang patch will be outlawed.
Well, I suppose when it comes to campaigning, there's nothing that's better than a stunt, and you've obviously you've learnt the basic of a good quality stunt, and I'm proud of you. Well done.
David, do you want to make a comment with respect to the ongoing speculation around importing forms of Australian policy, both with respect to prohibiting 16-year-olds from accessing social media? It's not explicitly a freedom of speech question, but there are questions around access to information. And also, likewise, just recently, they have banned the swastika. Would you ever seek to see some sort of ban like that introduced here?
Well, I mean, the swastika is just such a good example of why standing up for free speech is not for the faint-hearted, because you inevitably end up defending people that you would never invite over for dinner yourself.
Every day.
Yeah, that's your problem. And so I said, well, I actually don't think a swastika ban's a good idea. So then they asked me about their gang patches, and I said, well, that's about intimidation. And Stuffed, which is a new news program at 6 o'clock on TV3, they've stopped. Well, it's a program. I mean, they've stopped releasing their ratings a long time ago. They ran their lead item as, basically David Seymour defends swastika, which is, just absurd. I think that's a good example of what you guys no doubt put up with, and we do too. In terms of importing more Australian policies, I think around the phones and the internet access for young people, I mean, it's a debate that's worth engaging in for a couple of reasons. One is when I go to schools, there's two types of schools. There's schools who say the phone ban was absolutely irrelevant, we were already doing it. And then there's those that say, thank God it gave us the plausible deniability. And the thing that really worries me about that is that a principal should not need anyone to give them plausible deniability to govern their school. Nonetheless, that's where we are. The other interesting thing is I've seen the return of autographs. I go to schools, and because they used to ask for selfies, now they ask for autographs, which is kind of cool, very in a sort of 90s way. Yet when it comes to parents, it's just fascinating. I've been doing a lot of touring around talking to people in relation to school attendance. And I met a youth aid police officer who told me that he actually had confiscated or stolen a teenager's bedroom door. And I said, well, mate, I'm no lawyer, but aren't you supposed to prevent burglaries and theft? And he said, well, it wasn't. The parents asked, it was the parents' property, they asked me to take it. I said, well, this is just bizarre. He said, no, I've got a whole room filled with Xboxes and PlayStations that I've taken at the request of the parents. Now, I promise this is coming back to our topic. And he said, because the parents feel so disempowered in their own home, that they actually literally asked me to come and be the bad cop and enforce rules. And this is all to do with why they're not going to school, because they're up all night on the PlayStation and the parents can't stop them, and they get the cop to come and do it. Once you look at something like that and you think about, well, what is the damage? And I think that if you read Jonathan Haidt, there's a very real case that phones are dramatically changing kids' brains, because everyone I talk to in education will say that something has gone really wrong in the last 10 years. And so I think that there is a real problem. It is to do with phones. And if you take those examples from the COP and the schools needing the plausible deniability, then suddenly you say, okay, well, parents feel unable to actually, control what their kids are doing. Then maybe you can get into a territory where reasonable people would say, well, maybe the government does need to send some sort of signal or put some sort of restriction on young people's access to the internet and devices. I'm just making this as the best argument that you can make in the circumstances. Now, I think the flip side is, the government's been completely hopeless at stopping teenagers access porn, so why the hell do you think that they'd be any good at stopping them accessing the internet more generally? You're just not going to have a chance against the ingenuity of kids with a form of addiction, so forget about it. That's the flip side. But I think this whole area around phone use, psychology, children's development, the role of government, I think it's an area that, my starting point is, look, we've taken care of the 6 hours they're at school. You're a parent, you deal with the other 18 hours on the weekend. That's your problem. But if you go past that starting point, I think there's an interesting discussion to be had.
Yeah, please.
I'm, as I was saying, quite strident in terms of freedom of rights and do what you want and so on, but I do have a sort of a line in my brain at what age you can allow that, and we don't allow sexual intercourse below a certain age because the brains are too ill-formed and they're too young and they don't have the ability to make judgments. And so I'm really quite keen on exploring things that you can do for young people, that if they were old enough and mature enough, they make that decision themselves. I'm really disappointed in the current government for not having moved on puberty blockers, because this idea of saying I'm going to make my 4-year-old boy decide he can be a girl now and wear a tutu, and we're going to put puberty blockers on it to stop him developing and so on, when nearly every country I've got some respect for have said, no, we're moving on this, and they have. And this has just sat around for some time. Now, you want to become a transgender and whatever after you're 18 or 16 or whatever you think, go to it. Have a sex change every year if you want to, I don't care. But I don't want that to be the same case for kids. And that's why I think the idea of what Albanese is doing in Australia is certainly worth thinking about. David's right, you could never do it with pornography, but that's an anonymous user. You just go on to pornhub whatever it is, co.nz, and... Well, I've got a friend who told me you can do this. But you see, you can't do...
What do you talk to your friends about?
But you see, mainly about politics, actually. But listen, you can actually block off people on Facebook and so on because they have to have a user ID and who they are so they can socialise with their friends. The only reason people go on those things is they can show, hey, look what I just did, or I just did a TikTok video. So it's different to porn, which is anonymous stuff. And so if you have a little digital key that could be issued to somebody and they can't have an access to that system without the key, and then you can police it based. Still there'll be people that get around it. There'll be people that will set up some sort of a virtual private network and come out of a server in Uzbekistan, but they can't use their name and their face if they're under 16 because you can see that they're that person. I've just got a big black line down the middle of my brain as young people need a bit of protection for some of this stuff. Once you're old enough, you go to it, do what you want.
Let's open up to the room now and see what questions are out there. We've got probably 12 minutes before we head up for our last session. Let's start with Professor Hamilton Hart over in the corner here.
Thank you. Look, all credit, especially to David, for championing the cause of free speech in this country. But I worry that it will become or has already become a political football. And if the other side of politics is not persuaded of the virtues of having a level playing field and an open contest of ideas, eventually the government will change and all of these things will be reversed. So how do you champion free speech as politicians while also persuading your opposition?
Well, I mean, in fairness, I said in half jokingly, there's a lot of people here probably like to claim the credit for it, but we did manage to defeat hate speech laws from opposition. So you can win that way. I think more generally, we've got a big job to do, which is winning, if you like, the culture war of showing people on the left that actually, for the goals that you have, some of the values and solutions we propose will get you there faster. And it's exactly what Maurice said in his opening speech, that actually, the policies of freedom allow people to solve their problems and flourish faster. And what I was trying to say at the beginning, I may not have said it especially well, is that there is a new way to think about kindness, and it is valuing each person for who they are, not telling them that in order to be valuable they have to become someone else. And I think one day I actually, Brooke van Velden is the author of these thoughts about celebrating people for who they are, but you can further extrapolate it to say, look, once upon a time we'd say no matter who you are, you're valuable. Now we say, oh, you had a bad day, maybe you're a boy. And that I think is obviously an exaggeration, but that's how far we've come from that whole 80s 90s self-esteem movement.
Can I just call David up on your reference to the left or right? Is that fair to the opponents of free speech that are emerging in our society? Is there anything left-wing about what they're doing? Or actually we're talking about a spectrum that steps beyond what we see as legitimate democracy anymore? Because I think there are many, even here today, while it doesn't look like it on the panel, there are many participants from the Free Speech Union who are more left-wing. And I'm not sure if we do build that coalition and the alliance that we could, where we're not creating opponents out of those we don't need to by using language that divides along a political spectrum.
Yeah, I think you've got to be careful of that. I mean, the only point I'd make is you've got 100,000 members, haven't you, or something like that? I mean, I think these arguments need to be had at every school board level, at every university
And that's why yesterday
level.
we announced a professional membership for teachers. If you're a teacher in the room, sign up, and that is exactly, what is it, 2,500 schools around the country, members in every one of them.
Precisely, but and also in the Labour Party and all the political parties, and it's a matter of winning the argument, and you've got to make the case at every place and every thing. This is absolutely not a left and right thing. The division fault line is more emerged between sort of identity politics versus sort of universal values, and standing up for universal values is I think the key thing that needs to be done, but it needs to be done everywhere, and that's a challenge.
Over to you, Marty.
Yeah, hello. My name's Gareth, and I used to like shooting guns and posting on X. Unfortunately, both of those things had to stop very recently, thanks to police coming to my house armed and forcing their way into my house and turning off my recording devices, which I was using to record them. So I'm glad you guys think the legal framework around free speech is in a good place, but I'm on the cold front here, and I don't think it's in a good place. I don't think the police are listening to you. And I have evidence that the police have recorded at least 2 non-crime hate incidents against me, and I don't believe they have any legal framework to do so. I see inaction from my politicians, and I'm not sure where to turn. I cannot post without being monitored by the police, and they don't have a warrant. That's my understanding of where I'm at right now. I can't express myself freely. This is
Gareth, which actually isn't his name, of course, because if many of you will know, we've broadcasted and taken on Gareth's case, and I think you're a father of triplets with other children in your house. You've got a lot on your plate right now, and when police show up at your door, the way that was carried out is not acceptable in a free society. If we can just be very clear about that.
And I do appreciate the help the Free Speech Union have given me and the support, because I hadn't been out of the house for 2.5 years when I had two-year-old triplets, mate. And the only interaction I have with the state, apart from them taking $700 off me every week, is to come and tell me I'm expressing myself too freely, even though I'm acting within the law 100% of the time.
Well,
Any comment there? There was no question there, so we'll just appreciate that comment. It's worth making. Let's go to the back.
You guys are really good at talking and confident. So I wanted to say what a fantastic conference this is. It blows my mind how we're able to communicate without being censored. So thank you very much. It's way better than I expected.
Nothing like low expectations.
Oh, what's up there? That's way out there. I'm really keen to talk about an elephant that hasn't been spoken about yet, which is medical freedom of speech. And I noticed this blind spot, Jonathan, when you said that people were censored back in the bad old days, but things are good now. So I left the this is in social media, left the conference in that wee break, and I did a little survey in the outside world, and I asked a number of people, because I work medically and with the vaccine injured, but we haven't spoken about. And so the vaccine injured person says, Jonathan, we are still completely censored. Facebook always removes things we share. Let us have free speech, especially when we can back it up what we're saying with correct information. So
Can I clarify?
let me
Yeah,
please
sure,
take them
yep.
all,
No, of
the
course.
whole.
Yep,
Thanks. The second was from a medical advocate. She said, well, after I recounted what you said, well, for a start off, I was censored completely on mainstream media and on social media throughout. Shadow banned, put in Facebook jail for printing scientific articles on vitamin D and its effect on your immunity, which is helpful for everybody. And without warning, they removed the vaccine injury support group of 58,000 vax injured or mandated at the end of 2021. And then finally, from a group of doctors, over 200 doctors, they don't get any say in media. This isn't commented on by you guys. This is extremely important. And also, again, they are banned within social media. So censorship is rife, and I think you should speak to this if you're into free speech. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you for your question. Yeah. An important subject you raised. If I can just clarify the comment I made earlier, I was specifically asked, is the New Zealand government working with platforms to have content removed? And I said, we are aware of specific cases where this occurred during COVID. We are not aware, and I do not believe that is occurring now. I think I also did say clearly that Meta is without a doubt still moderating and enforcing their policies. And that's a major conversation to have. I would also say, and perhaps not to your satisfaction, but this is an issue that the Free Speech Union has consistently spoken about. We ran an extensive campaign to Minister Van Velden to lobby her for the expansion of the terms of reference on COVID-19 so that we could have a far wider conversation, because I entirely agree, it really does matter. But does anyone on the panel want to mention speech around COVID-19 and vaccine injury? How are we navigating that as a society?
Well, I mean, I go back to that framework of legal and cultural. You know, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing the New Zealand government's doing or any law that Parliament's passed that is suppressing people's freedom of speech around the pandemic, the vaccines, and I'm really proud of the way that we have kept the Royal Commission legally intact, but totally changed the terms of reference and the people on it, so we'll get a real inquiry. I think that's a big success. Then you come back to that cultural issue. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, Meta's a private company. There's probably some people in Parliament who think that the New Zealand government should start a social media company, but I'm not one of them, and I don't think it'll be a very big success. So this is a challenge, and it's a challenge for us too. I mean, I remember meeting Google representatives, and they're basically saying, well, we're going to suppress anything to do with firearms. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but it's a legitimate campaign issue. The policies around firearms are very much in play. We're a political party. Surely if you support democracy, you're not going to prevent us from talking to our potential voters about what our policies are. So we're up against it too, and I don't have a particularly good answer for what a government, which is, you know, really by American terms the government of a large city or a small state, going to do about Meta and Google.
I just want to do one quick thing about the mandate issue. I'm a big fan of vaccines. I've got a science background. I was first up on the first day because I lived in South Auckland, even though we're in Pakuranga, I think we're in the east. And they said if you're over 65, you can come on day one. So for the first time, I was proud to live in South Auckland and head off and got my vaccine on day one. So I'm a big fan of vaccines, but I don't understand why you have to have mandates. And here's why I get to that. I had it when I was a member of Parliament, and schools had, you know, a lot of kids that had been, you know, vaccinated for various things. And then they were saying, well, we should be banning the kids that are not. And I kept saying, but hang on. Your kids have been vaccinated so they don't get this stuff. What does it matter if there's someone in the class that hasn't been vaccinated? They might get it, and they might be bloody crook, but your kids have been vaccinated and are safe. So there's no need for a mandate. There's no need for any rule. If you want to go, as I did, and ran as fast as I could to get the vaccine and keep up to date with it because I'm a believer, you may not be, I find that fine. But the idea that I'm going to tell you, you're going to do it or you can't stay on your job, you can't mix, you can't have people to your house, I just found that just beyond the pale for a country like New Zealand to have got into.
And can I build on...
Yes, there was no opposition from the opposition parties during the time of that, so the actual opposition needs to...
I'm sorry, mate, but we worked pretty bloody hard through that whole period. If you didn't hear it, I'm sorry.
Hold on, Alistair, we're just going to go back to back room there.
Yeah, hi, my name's Johanna Herbert, and I'm a first-year law student at Waikato University. I'm not going to say what I'm saying because I'm complaining for my own sake. I'm a big girl, and I observe what's going on, but I am just so concerned, so concerned about what's going on. For the first start of this year, we had 6 weeks of full-on tikanga indoctrination under the changing the law system, revolutionising the law, and teaching law students how to know that they have the ability to change it and to bring in the new law. I'm a licensed firearms owner. Part of our legal studies was around gun reform in New Zealand, but essentially demonising licensed firearms owners, and displaying different categories of firearms licence with Nazi signs alongside them in the lectures. But the most concerning part for me was a politics class that I was part of, where the room, I'm online, so I know that the room at the university is full of 18-year-olds, and the professor announced to the class in context, and obviously it had a build-up, so it was emotionally in context, that she was so afraid of climate change. It absolutely terrified her that there were too many people on the planet and that we didn't want any more children being born. Now, I burst into tears behind my screen. I was so angry and so sad. And I got in and I tackled that one individually, one-on-one with her, and I ended up getting an apology and an admittance that it had gone completely wrong. But my question is, there are certain things that can wait and there are certain things that can't. And that kind of behaviour in the universities with young minds, with 18-year-olds who have their whole lives ahead of them, being told that they shouldn't have children by the person who's marking their grades and holding their university degree in front of them, it's sick. And what can be done? What can somebody do? Because I'm too ignorant to know.
Can I commend your response at this point, and we might hear a more substantive contribution here, but what you did is you used counter speech to go and speak to your professor, and it sounds like that was a relatively constructive exchange. Now, you're right, that doesn't have the same public audience, and that's something that needs to be addressed. Diversity of opinion in our universities is at a critical level. But what you did there was you didn't just stay silent, you didn't just keep that in. And the marketplace of ideas will only function if we participate in the marketplace of ideas. There's no reason to think good ideas will be bad ideas if we don't put our good ideas forward. So thank you for speaking up. Do any of you have an idea of
there's not enough of me. I will always speak up. There's not enough of me there. There's so many. There's 400 law students. I don't know how many
that's the cultural
politics
problem
students.
Way,
there's not enough.
Well, and look, I mean, I think the biggest challenge for the country in that example, it's a shocking example, and I haven't heard it as bad as that, is people just vote with their feet. And in the schools where my kids have been a lot are going to Australia for exactly those sorts of reasons. And so a huge challenge. I think we've got a huge challenge in the universities, and our Minister for Tertiary Education is very focused on that. You start, of course, with the board appointments, and then you have the legislative environment, and David's doing some work on that. And it sounds like, obviously there's a lot more work to do. But ultimately, people have choice, but they shouldn't have to have a choice like that.
Just also, the other thing, it's appointments, it's budget, and it's policy. The appointments were certainly turning over the university boards as rapidly as possible. The policy is really about changing the curriculum to make it knowledge rich and dense. So you've had, I think, a pretty impressive group of people on there, some of them associated with the Free Speech Union, who have been able to change the policy. And if you put enough strong content in there, you actually flush out the space for a lot of all the other crap. And the other area specifically is more of an Acts-related thing, is reviewing the so-called Aotearoa Histories curriculum, which really is just this dismal story of victims and villains. So look, we've got to be honest where we're at. The institutions have been colonised, ironically, by people with a certain set of views, which you can call it Marxist or postmodern or whatever. But those things we need to sort. And I believe that we are doing everything that we can as rapidly as possible. What I'd like to see is more advocacy for people like you in university classes across the country to be able to get together and actually share their ideas, call it out, identify it, and organise to use more counter-speech. Having said that, I remember sustainability in engineering school. They used to get Jeanette Fitzsimmons in to lecture us about all the woes and the sins of our profession. And I said, well, Rodney Hyde is also a member of Parliament and he's got an actual degree in biology and conservation and resource management. Would you have him? Not a chance. So to some extent, it is plus ça change, plus ça même change. I try to speak a language most of the audience doesn't understand at some point. With that, I apologise. I've got to attend to an urgent domestic affair which will affect my welfare a lot worse than anything any of you can do if I don't go. So thank you very much and good on you. It's great to be here. Thank you.
No, thank you. Cheers, yeah. Thank you all. That was fantastic. We're going to have a 5-minute Sorry.
I can't let this moment go without just giving you one last little clip. Okay? While I was in... okay.
Thank you, sir.
I've come back from the States and I've heard that many news people and that calling our country Aotearoa. And it's Aotearoa this and it's Aotearoa that. And some of you might love that. And I'm okay with it. But just let me tell you this one thing. I went into a number of wine shops in Los Angeles to get wine, and I heard people, young Americans, come and say, do you have any New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc? Yeah, we've got some. No, that's Australian. Have you got New Zealand? Yeah, New Zealand Sauvignon down the back. I was in butcher shops where a lady arguing, no, I want New Zealand lamb, not Chilean. The brand name that we've spent billions of building a name. No, New Zealand might be some bloody piece of part of, what is it, Holland or Denmark or what, I don't really care. But the fact that we've spent billions building a brand name of product that Americans and others desperately, New Zealand honey and things. I never heard one person ask for an Aotearoa wine the whole time I was up there. So can we stop some of the nonsense that goes on in the media?